What did you say?
Say something while I.
Oh, well, hello everyone. Thanks for showing up out of this beautiful day to share this with us. This is actually my very first Zoom event. Yay! So if I end up cratering the whole thing, it will be because I inadvertently touched the button and I shouldn't have done that. But I'm grateful for your presence, for your attention. I'm grateful for Eileen for spending 2 hours this afternoon, showering and putting on her makeup, blow drying her hair so that she can look absolutely fabulous. I'm grateful that you did that. I'm grateful that Melinda, found a new color lipstick. Look at that vampiric purple, there. Oh my God, I'm grateful for the good father, Parang. I can't say Parang because I can't pronounce R. Eileen, how long am I supposed to blather to fill in this? Everyone else can chat.
Not even 5 o'clock yet, Eileen.
Not even 5 o'clock.
We're going.
Yeah. I wore this shirt for you, Red. I have so much respect for what I hear of your work. So thank you for showing up. Please, this is Red, right? Michelle, of course, is my permanent IT support, whether or not she wants to be in that role. Well, thank you for all the years of service for that in the past and coming up. Look, and look, we can see Aileen Cassinetto, who is working so hard that her head is bowed like this. She's trying to figure out the meaning of life. I believe in 2 minutes is when we start this proceeding. So, it's like odd for me to be talking when I don't really know who's listening aside from the faces on the screen. So,
Katie Cariaga is coming online.
Ading, Katie, Tadaka. Katie's the only one with whom, when we sign our books to each other, we sign off with obscenities. I mean, Ilocano obscenities, man. So did she leave?
She's still connecting the audio, so she can't hear you yet.
I am happy for the retro that you're smoking a cigarette with your with your pink. I mean, I love that. I totally love that. It's very subversive. Katie, will you stop walking away and join the festivities?
She's fixing the audio.
Eileen, stop making everyone laugh.
What? And Oscar, would you go to the bathroom already? I mean, my God, is that your bed I'm looking at? Actually, I shouldn't take this disrespectfully. This is, he was at the IHOP Hotel, a historic site in for Philippine American history. Manong Oscar. So, and it's a good thing that Lenny blacked her face out because I'd be, picking on her a lot.
You mean you can see Lenny?
No, I can only see her name, right? We can see her name, but not her face. Yeah. 1 minute to, right, Eileen? And then, okay.
We're ready. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aileen Cassinetto. I'm the publisher of Paloma Press, and it's my honor to welcome you to a conversation and book launch for the short story collection Pagpag. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us her first ever Zoom and Facebook Live event.
Too bright.
The author of Pagpag, Eileen Tabios. Joining Eileen are some of the most distinguished panelists ever assembled. Roy Barrios, Albert Alejo, Nerissa Balse, Renato Redentor Constantino, and S. Lily Mendoza, along with Herna, Cruz-Louie, Melinda Luisa de Jesus, and Michelle. To celebrate the launch, I'm pleased to announce that Pagpag is also available for purchase at the special discounted price of $10. Just email me or Eileen directly if you wish to have an autographed copy. Our contact information is posted on the Facebook event page and at palomapress.net. If you have any questions for our panelists later, please raise your digital hand if you're in Zoom or comment below the post if you're watching through Facebook Live. Magandang umaga, Pilipinas. Ikinagagalak namin lahat na makapanayam kayo ngayong araw na ito. Kung mayroon kayong katanungan o kung nais ninyong lumahok sa usapan, mangyari lang po na i-post ang inyong mensahe dito sa Facebook Live page. Now, please welcome members of the American Center of Philippine Arts with director and co-founder Herna, Cruz-Louie, who will play the Philippine National Anthem, to be followed by Melinda Luisa de Jesus, poet, professor at California College of the Arts, and mezzo-soprano, who will share her rendition of the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice.
Lift every voice and sing till the heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing above the listening skies. Let it resound loud as a rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun, let us march on till victory is won.
So very beautiful and moving. Thank you so much, Herna and Melinda. It is now my pleasure to introduce Aileen Tabios, author of over 60 collections of poetry, fiction, essays, and experimental biographies from publishers in 10 countries. Her 2020 books include her third short story collection, Pagpag, The Dictator's Aftermath in the Diaspora. The book already has received some early praise. Ninochka Rosca calls it effing brilliant. Bino Realuyo says it adds texture to our already failed historical memory. And the San Francisco Review of Books calls it an excellent collection of short stories. Please welcome Aileen Tabios.
Good evening from a mountain in Napa Valley, California, on the indigenous land of the Wapo people. Thank you all for being here, and salamat to Paloma Press and Aileen Cassinetto, co-host Michelle Bautista, moderator Joy Barrios, and panelists Lily Mendoza, Father Albert Alejo, Nerissa Balsa, and Red Constantino, as well, of course, as Herna Cruz-Louie and Melinda Luisa de Jesus, because what's a Filipino event without music and song? thank you for that beginning. So a book launch is usually a celebration. And though I love you all, for me, this book launch is not. We are indeed launching a book I would not have wanted to write or release. I wrote most of these stories in the 1990s. I'd hoped they would be relegated to the dust heap of history because they would have become dated, if not irrelevant. Unfortunately, these stories, written in the aftermath of Ferdinand Marcos's dictatorship, have become more relevant in the current period of the Philippines under Rodrigo Duterte. There's a reason why my book has an epigraph, a statement by Jose Rizal. The glory of saving a country is not for him who contributed to its ruin. I was 10 years old when I left the Philippines for the United States. Less than 2 years later, Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law. So I never experienced the Marcos rule within the Philippines. This book's stories, thus, come from a point of view of being located in the diaspora, several ostensibly from the point of views of children of anti-Marcos activists who had fled the Philippines. Let me please stress the diasporic point of view. That's all I can talk about, as I'm aware that I'm not living in the Philippines. But I only decided last year to collect the stories into a book after observing the human rights atrocities caused by Duterte's regime. I thought then that even as my stories are fiction, my book Pagpag might serve to remind how actions have such prolonged effects. The book's idea of presenting fictionalized children of anti-Marcos activists, now grown up and coping with their legacies, is really also a metaphorical call for bettering our actions, as actions do become legacies and can have impact for generations afterward. I believe many of you know that I love books. I believe a book is more than just a collection of pages and words. A book can be a portal through which readers engage and perhaps afterwards look at the world with different eyes. And I wished Pagpag to contribute as a reminder of the Philippines martial law period to help mitigate against what poet-novelist Bino Realuyo has called a failed historical memory. Pagpag contains 11 short stories. Some were inspired by anti-martial law activists I met on the East Coast a long time ago, and I bow to them in memory. I've chosen to read an excerpt from A Ghost Haunting. This happens to be the first short story I've ever had published. I wrote it in 1995, and the protagonist is a female investment banker. No doubt because at the time I had written it, I had just ended a nearly 10-year career as a banker to become a writer. So briefly from A Ghost Haunting. I am accosted sometimes at airports, elevators, restaurants, and other public spaces by strangers who consider me familiar because they met women eager to attract America, and they find them of Angie, Susan, Josefina, Lillian, Emma, and even Baby, with whom quite a wrong good time. What I always want to say is how totally sure I am that Vanjie, Susan, Josefina, Lillian, Emma, and yes, even Baby undoubtedly sought their company solely because of their manly charms, and not because some old parent otherwise would die of starvation back in a village, not because some infant is desperately waiting for milk, and certainly not because there is no alternative for earning daily bread when male relatives are known to have prices on their head for fighting back against the thuggery of a corruption's private army. But I never say anything because they may not understand my brand of sarcasm. I only walk away, marveling at how I once thought that an expensive business suit is like an armor. Yes, armor. Ever since Ferdinand Marcos mugged nearly 2 decades of progress from the Philippines, I have believed I needed armor against the embarrassment of being defined by the antics of Ferdinand's greed, Imelda's extravagance, the conspiracy of a minority grabbing scraps from the Marcoses' table, and the resulting impoverishment, psychological as well, of many so-called Filipinos. Ferdinand Marcos, even as he watched during the waning days of his regime, the masses of Filipinos shoving themselves in front of his military tanks, forcing their hearts in front of his military's gun, could not understand. Even when his own military, ill-equipped to battle the tears and sampaguita blossoms being shed on their M16s and Browning automatic rifles, broke ranks and joined the People's Revolution led by a housewife, Ferdinand Marcos could not. Oh, but truly, he had the support of the people, as he claimed in 60 Minutes. After all, he won the presidential election, Ferdinand Marcos announced, ignoring documented accounts of ballot rigging and murderous intimidation of election overseers. But the image of his swollen face was quickly supplanted. In February 1986, the world's television cameras roamed Epifanio de los Santos and other avenues of Manila, capturing the solidarity of the protesting socialites, slum dwellers, non-prostitutes, businessmen, politicians, urbanites, and farmers. For a moment in time, the Filipinos forgot their internal discord and looked larger than life under the spotlight of a hot sun. In my younger days, my brothers, sisters, cousins, and I spent many evenings at the house of Apong, our grandmother. We would fall asleep on bamboo mats spread out in a large room. We would fall asleep to her bedtime stories of ghosts, from skinny ghosts who tickle mischievous children to ghosts of plump women who love to pinch the cheeks of children who eat too much. Then there was her last benediction for the evening. Apong always counseled, individual sticks are easily broken, but when bundled together, a different matter. So the story ends with a grandmother advising how individually each of us is weaker than if we were part of a larger whole. Call that whole community. Call it collaboration. Call it the masses underlying a revolution. Call it kapwa, that indigenous Filipino trait of seeing ourselves in others, thereby caring about each other. How then may such a kapwa love help us create a better life for others and those who come after us? And how might we, when Pagpag, something that would have been unimaginable when I was a child, is now normalized, relegating the poor to eating garbage, including the diseases that inhabit them. Surely we can do better. Thank you for listening. I look forward to hearing the others' views on the topics raised in Pagpag. Salamat.
Thanks, Eileen. And now we'd like to introduce the first of our several panelists to discuss and have comments around the topics in Pagpag. Our first is Joy Barrios LeBlanc, serves as a lecturer at UC Berkeley after working as associate professor at the University of the Philippines. Her books include To Be a Woman is to Live at a Time of War. She was among the 100 women weavers of history chosen for the Philippine Centennial in 1998. Please welcome Joy Barrios LeBlanc.
Hello. Okay. So I actually even have a title. The title of what I wrote for Eileen's book is Fiction's Truth, or Why We Need to Devour Pagpag in Our Hunger for Justice. Okay. So as we grapple with ways by which we fight against media repression, and the anti-terror bill in the Philippines, Aileen Tabios presents us with Pagpag, the dictator's aftermath in the diaspora. Now, this warrior writer has an arsenal in both prose and poetry. She weaponizes irony, humor, data, and memory so that we may remember the past and continue our struggle. First, allow me to say that the book is a joy to read because it makes us laugh. For if there's one thing I remember about being an activist during martial law, back to me, me and myself, it is that we used laughter. We mocked those in power, and drawing from Mikhail Bakhtin's discussion of the Carnivalesque, this laughter was necessary in the decrowning of the dictator. Moreover, the book also reminded me of family and friends who managed to joke even during dark times, of how political work was made lighter by shared laughter, and how amidst fear of detention, we made up funny songs so that we can remember what number to call. For example, 787851, ang numero ng TFD, so the tax force detainees. Okay. So, yeah, what lingers after reading the book is pain, sadness, anger. To understand this wide range of emotions, dami-dami, I tried to list what I appreciate most about the book. Number 1, details and memory. Number 2, absence and presence. Number 3, data and conversations interrupting narratives. 4, interrogative characters, humor, and horror. And 5, truth in fiction versus autobiographies. Number 1, details and memory. For migrant workers and immigrants, memory is a sacred thing. For example, we get bothered, perhaps even incensed, when we read texts that talk about fishing for milkfish in the ocean or looking for durian trees in Manila. This is a question, however, not only of authenticity, but of being deprived of a shared memory. In contrast, Pagpag offers details not only of paksiw and Swiss Miss chocolate, but also my favorite, star apple. Why? Because you cannot buy star apple from the palengke. You either have a tree or someone in your neighborhood has one. These details are important because they underline the difference between truth and self-exoticism. Number 2, absence and presence. The characters are either absent from the homeland or are visitors in the homeland, but the homeland is ever present in their lives. What I appreciate most is the process of knowing in the stories. In Negros, for example, that's the title of the short story, we have one paragraph after the other, starting with the words, I learned. I learned that the land is comprised as much as 98% of Negros' population. I learned that the land before promised, blah, blah, blah. I learned that Negros was a microcosm. This is in contrast to the know-it-all stance of many texts that flaunt knowledge about Philippine culture. Instead of being native informants, authorities in Philippine history, or knowledge bearers, the characters in the book are shown as people in progress and reminds us that as migrants, there is much that we don't actually know. So, number 3, data and conversations interrupting narratives. The book is brave. Why? It is not afraid of 2 things. Data, and conversations with dictators. It lists statistics and talks about a preserved corpse while telling a story of flirtation. A story ends not just with a portrait of the Baguio sky, but in between the adjectives directly addresses a dictator and accuses him, your river stained more than 7,000 islands. We see this elsewhere in the book and can be likened to a Brechtian strategy, so Bertolt Brecht, right? Strategy, breaking the fourth wall to enable the audience or the reader to reflect and think critically of the text. Number 4, interrogative characters, horror, and humor. A not so likable immigrant screaming at an old lady working in a laundromat. a do-gooder woman accused of being Miss Armchair Participant, Marites, reinventing Marites. We are ambivalent with our feelings with these characters in the book. Like, dislike, sympathetic, antipathetic. There are ghosts in the past of the characters, ghosts that seemingly one can hear, and the ghosts of the dictatorship. There are stories that are funny, ha ha, lechon, and are funny, ha ha, with a catch in the throat. Because learning to faint can be a whole discussion on hunger, Maria Clara, and despair. Which brings me to my fifth point. Last point. Number 5, truth in fiction. In recent years, even the former Minister of Defense, Juan Ponce Enrile, has published an autobiography, supposedly cementing his image as the hero of EDSA. His autobiographies can be problematic not only because memory is unreliable, but also because the epic storyteller tends to construct herself as an epic hero. It is thus important to have books such as Pagpag with imperfect characters and their contradictions so we can underline the truth. In 1988, the Cultural Center of the Philippines published a 3-volume collection of poetry, fiction, and drama of martial law texts. There are many other creative works that similarly talk about poverty, corruption, and political repression. Tabios' Pagpag, however, gives us a new perspective, that of immigrants constantly looking back and, more importantly, engaging with the issues of the homeland. Finally, a warning ha, just in case you're interested in poverty porn, kawawa naman stories, or bida ako, I'm so dakila narratives. Please note, this book is not about nostalgia, nor is it about the exotic. This is also not the story of invincible heroes successfully dodging whizzing bullets. But read this book, because thankfully, we can turn to fiction to tell the truth against dictators, past and present. Bravo, Eileen! Yay!
Thank you, Joy. And our next speaker is Albert Alejo, otherwise known as Parang Bert, is a Filipino Jesuit priest and professor of sociology, anthropology, and systematic theology and philosophy at the Ateneo de Manila University, with a focus that includes Christian social ethics, corruption and violence, and the formation of social conscience, intercultural and interreligious dialogue. Welcome, Parang Bert.
Hey, hello. Paano ba to? Mute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I have a short PowerPoint presentation. Now, first of all, I'd like to say thank you. Salamat. Nasama ako dito. At my presentation would be not a book review because I've not read the book, and I feel envious nga eh. Sabi ko, nakakaingit naman sila, may hawak na ng libro. Pinadala sa akin yung PDF file, pero gipit sa oras. But what I'd like to do now is to review the title. I want to celebrate the title. And I'd like to show the possibilities of the title. So, pwede ba ako mag-share, mag-screen share? Please allow me to share.
Yes, at the bottom of the screen, it should say
host
share screen.
disabled participant screening share.
Okay, let's do that.
Allow me first.
Let's see here, all participants.
So,
are you able to share now?
ayan, pwede na.
Okay.
Okay. So, so I'd like to celebrate the highlighting of the word pagpag. According to Aileen, there's no single story focusing on pagpag. Tama ba, Eileen? Oo. Anyway, so ang gusto kong gawin dito ay ipagdiwang yung pagkaka-highlight sa salitang pagpag. I'd like to celebrate that and show the possibilities of the word pagpag. And pagpag, literally, and it's the only meaning you can find in Tagalog, Filipino English Dictionary. It means to shake off dirt or dust. So sinasabing, oy, ipagpag mo muna yung tsinelas mo bago ka pumasok. Otherwise, you'll be entering with the dirt. So shake off dirt or dust. Whether it's clothing or tsinelas or shoes, you shake off the dirt. Pagpag. Ganyan. Okay. So that's the literal meaning of pagpag. Now, more popularly now, it has come to mean scavenging food. Sabi nga ng isa, this is the real junk food. Because it's food that you get from the junk. Galing sa basura. Anong ginagawa ng mga bata? Kung nakakuha ng natirang hita ng manok, ipapagpag kasi pwede pang makain yun. You can still have a lunch or dinner from that. Now, food waste is survival for poor Filipinos. But I'd like to say that there are other meanings of pagpag and could probably be launched later on. And thank you, Eileen, for highlighting the word pagpag. There is a film called Pagpag. Tungkol to sa sa mga superstitious beliefs on death and attending funerals. If you attend the funeral or awake yung lamay sa patay, you should not go home directly because the bad spirits, the ghost haunting might follow you and enter your house as well. So pagpag means that visitors should not directly go to their homes after visiting awake and instead hang out somewhere else so as to avoid having any bad spirits follow you home. That's another meaning of pagpag, and it's not in the dictionary, but it's in the film. Ano na yan? Local idiom na yan. And I think it's important, no? Yung avoiding the bad spirits following you. So shaking off the bad spirits. Now, there is another meaning of pagpag, and it's not in the dictionary, but it is in our experience of giving sanctuary, for example, to truth tellers and whistleblowers. When we try to secure truth tellers and whistleblowers, we need to evade those who are stalking us. So driving in the context of a secret mission, we have to change routes, speed. We have to change our speed or cross to the other lane in order to confuse possible stalker. So galing yan sa yung pagpag sa pag-attend ng lamay. So pagpag, alisin mo yung mga bad spirits para wag sumunod sa'yo. Ito naman, baka may sumusunod sa'yo kapag itinatago mo yung mga truth tellers at mga whistleblowers. Okay? Now, there's also an application of that. Now, yung pagpag na kila Bongbong Marcos, na pinapagpag nila by rebranding, pinapagpag nila yung mga masasamang image ng family nila. Ito yung bumulaga kanina sa akin kanina umaga. That Bongbong Marcos asked Cambridge Analytica to rebrand family image. Pinapagpag nila. Yeah. Now, I'd like to repeat that, to review these things. Pagpag, literally shake off dirt. Yun yung normal. Pero, ang nangyari dito sa mga, because of the poverty, pagpag has come to mean a different thing. And it's really extremely, very, very sad. And I've seen this. But I'd like to also set this in a political note. Itong superstitious belief na mayroong mga bad spirits coming from the wake. Nung pumunta ako sa wake ni Kian, yung 17 years old na pinatay recently. So pagkatapos namin doon, sabi, oy, magpagpag muna tayo. Kain muna tayo sa Jollibee ba o sa ano. Bakit? Kasi nga para wag sumunod yung mga masasamang espiritu. At sa ngayon, maraming nagpapagpag because of so many killings. And it's just unfortunate that because of these so many killings, my book on Sanayan Lang ang Pagpatay is also becoming popular again. Sanayan Lang Pagpatay, killing is a matter of getting used to. It's a matter of practice. You get used to this. It's a collection of poems which started in Davao City about so many killings, and it was published in the 1990s. But now it has gone into several reprints because of so many killings. And gusto kong sabihin na itong superstitious belief ay pwedeng i-expand din sa politika. Kailangan natin magpagpag dahil sobrang daming pinapatay at pag umatin ka, kailangan mong ipagpag yung mga espiritu, hindi para makalimutan ang mga dinalaw mong mga pinatay. Tanda ko itong salitang pagpag na to nung pumunta kami kay Kian. And it's a celebrated case of extrajudicial killing in Caloocan. There I saw Bishop Ambo saying Mass also, and we had our prayer. And this one, I learned the other meaning of pagpag. When we were trying to secure some whistleblowers, the former killers. So kapag inililipat namin yung lugar, okay, ihahatid doon sa yung pagkagaling sa Senate, kung nagsalita sila sa Senate, siyempre aalis kami sa Senate, baka binabantayan na kami sa labas. So sinasabi ng mga kasama namin, magpagpag muna tayo. Ano yung sabihin nun? Kailangan magpaliko-liko ng kalsada para hindi ka masundan ng mga masamang espiritu. So you have to change routes and change lanes and stop whether somebody is approaching us. That is another word for pagpag. So pagpag is a very rich terminology, which when I saw pagpag used as the title of the book, and I said, wow, this is a chance to celebrate and expand the use of the word pagpag, because most of the secret uses of pagpag are about the bad spirits and the dirt in society. Now, I'm afraid, that's why I'd like to highlight this. I'm afraid that if we are not quick enough, some other people might make use of it for their own interest. Like changing textbook histories, removing the evils of martial law in our readings. Parang pinapagpag nila ang dumi sa kanilang pangalan. Now, and then they call it rebranding. Okay, so I'm afraid that if we're not quick enough, other people might make use of that. Now, there are a number of possible ways of expanding our use of pagpag, but let me just review it to cut short my presentation. Number one, pagpag literally and originally means shaking off dirt that has stuck to an object, clothing, slippers, paper, book, etc., and you can expand it to dirt that has stuck to your name. Later on, nowadays, and it's the more popular meaning of pagpag, it's about hunger and poverty, shaking off dirt from waste food to eat whatever is still there to fill the stomach for survival. But that is not the only meaning of pagpag. Pagpag is also popular among ordinary people to shake off contamination from visiting wake or funeral in order to evade bad spirits that might follow you, because those who visit the victims of extrajudicial killings might also be followed. Kaya nga po yung iba takot dumalaw sa patay na biktima ng EJK kasi baka mamaya maging suspect sila. Okay? Now it can also, bad spirits could also be a nightmare. So some people would rather not talk about the evils of martial law. Huwag na natin pag-usapan yan. And I know some people would say, let's not talk about corruption, let's not talk about this evil, let's just talk about what is good. Yeah. Now the other thing is ambush, stalking. Shake off recognition by changing routes or speed to evade stalkers, because they might be after us. And then 5, if we're not careful and we're not quick enough, pagpag could be used by some other people for their own self-interest, like pagpagging their bad image in history books in public. Now, I'd like to add one last thing. In the Bible, Jesus says, if this new place does not accept you, then you shake off the dust. Ipagpag ninyo alikabok sa inyong paa. And that serves as a critique, as a protest. No? Now, you can argue against that, but that could also be, pagpag could also be used for decolonization process. Pagpag natin yung colonial mentality, etc., colonial discourse, so that we can re-intellectualize our discourse in an indigenous way. It could also, pagpag could also be a sign of grumbling, pagdadabog, and a critique and protest. It could also be expanded to refer to historical exorcism of the evil spirits that have invaded our consciousness. And positively, it can mean awakening from nightmare. So, Eileen, maraming salamat sa paggamit mo ng pagpag. Sabi mo nga, walang isang kwento dyan na tungkol mismo sa pagpag. Pero the fact that you highlighted the word pagpag, now you are launching a new term. You are launching a new energy. And I celebrate that with you. Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you, Parang Bert. And as Eileen would attest, she likes launching new terminology. Thank you for that. Our next speaker is Nerissa Balse. She's an associate professor of Asian American Studies at SUNY Stony Brook. Her research focuses on race, gender, state violence, and popular culture in the US and the Philippines. She wrote the award-winning book, Body Parts of Empire, Visual Objection, Filipino Images, and the American Archive. Let's welcome Nerissa Balse. So, I'll end that. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Nerissa Balse, an associate professor of Asian American Studies at SUNY Stony Brook. I teach courses on Asian American literature, film, and popular culture. And before I begin my brief remarks, I'd like to say thanks to Aileen Tabios, Michelle Bautista, and Aileen Cassinetto for inviting me to be part of this event that marks the publication of Aileen Tabios' new collection of short stories entitled Pagpag, The Dictator's Aftermath in the Diaspora. I was intrigued by the title of the collection because I study Filipino and Filipino diasporic culture that deals with the afterlife or the cultural legacies of the Marcos dictatorship. Eileen uses the term aftermath in her subtitle, which suggests temporality or time, and in particular, the consequences that follow a ruinous or traumatic event. And certainly for some Filipino immigrants, the Marcos dictatorship was traumatic. The Filipino or Tagalog term for martial law is batas militar. The period of martial law began in 1972 and ended in 1986. There's a feminist Chicana poet and writer by the name of Gloria Anzaldúa who has an interesting observation about migration to the United States. And she says that the experience of migration to El Norte or the United States is the open wound or the una herida abierta for Mexican, Chicano, and Latinx communities. So in my own writing, I consider the trauma of authoritarianism or the experience of martial law as the open wound for Filipino immigrants and the families they left behind in the Philippines. So martial law is our open wound, and it is a trauma that has no national boundaries, a trauma carried by generations, one that affects the memories and consciousness of Filipinos in the Philippines and those in the diaspora. There are some facts about martial law that we should remember. In the weeks following the declaration of martial law, the regime rounded up 50,000 men and women suspected of being subversives. 3,257 were killed, and an estimated 35,000 were tortured. To create fear, some 2,520 were tortured and killed, and their bodies were dumped on the streets for display. The Orwellian term for this Marcos-era practice was salvaging, and salvaging in the Philippine usage, the torture and killing, appears in the dystopian novel Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. But rather than end with the violence of fascism, I wanted to end with humor. One of the courses I teach at Stony Brook is a course on race and humor. And a theory of humor that I love to share with students is the theory of inversion, the reversal of power. We laugh when the cruelties of the world are exposed. We laughed when the powerful are made fun of, and they're taken down by a joke, an image, or a poem or a novel. And in this case, today, it's a short story. So this is the reason why fascists hate humor, because humor threatens their order, the order that they want, which is them on top. So humor brings them down to the level of the people. Aileen Tabios has one short story in Pagpag entitled Force Majeure. And the title refers to an irresistible compulsion or an extraordinary event, an act of God. So the short story is an anti-fascist and comic love story with young love as the irresistible force. In Force Majeure, cute meets cute and ends with anarchist hijinks, in particular the sabotaging of the Marcos Mausoleum in Lawag. We meet the unnamed narrator, a young Filipina with an Americanized accent, and she has, quote, an overflowing belly, virtually non-existent breasts, and an appetite for Swiss Miss, hot chocolate, and Mallow Mars. She's a self-possessed young woman, aware of her feminine power, but she also doesn't take herself very seriously. She's also knowledgeable about Philippine history, so that when she visits the Marcos Mausoleum, she says, quote, I long suspected Imelda was off her rocker. And she also says, quote, Imelda must have visited Lenin's tomb, because this would explain why Mrs. Marcos embalmed her beloved's body in wax. When the narrator looks at the handsome face of the working class Baguio boy named Nicky, this is the man she is attracted to and flirts with, she takes in his, quote, his brown, brown eyes and says, quote, his eyes woke me to the wonders of the color brown. When the young narrator discovers Nicky's hatred for Marcos, which mirrors her own hatred for the Marcos regime, her passion for chocolate becomes embodied in the brown eyes of Nicky. The young lovers decide to express their love for each other through a public act against the dictatorship. They decide to sabotage the air conditioning of the mausoleum. It heats up to 110 degrees. Following the heat of the countryside, the corpse releases a foul stench and the wax melts off of Marcos's face, leaving, quote, leaving behind a skull with hollowed eyes peering out of the stiff collars of his yellow tunic, end quote. So the story ends with the fascist funk permeating all over the mausoleum, and his creepy skull peeks out from the melting wax. And all this is the background for the lovers' first Antifa or anti-fascist kiss. Congratulations, Eileen. I really enjoyed reading this short story. And maraming salamat.
Thank you, Narissa. That was awesome. This is actually a pre-recorded video of Narissa as she works out some Wi-Fi issues on her end. So we want to make sure that she could be seen clearly. Our next speaker is Renato Redentor Constantino, or otherwise known as Red Constantino. He's the executive director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities and the author of The Poverty of Memory, Essays on History and Empire. He also manages the Constantino Foundation, which is dedicated to advancing the idea of a usable history where lessons from the past become active elements of the present. Welcome, Red Constantino.
Thank you. Thank you also to Aileen Cassinetto for inviting me to share a few words on the book of Aileen, Tabios. And so let me get to it right away. You'll have to forgive me if I begin with words from a book published in 1960. The topic is entirely different, but the imagery seems appropriate. At noon in the desert, a panting lizard waited for history, its elbows tense, watching the curve of a particular road, as if something might happen. It was looking at something farther off than people could see, an important scene acted in stone for little selves at the flute end of consequences. There was just a continent without much on it, under a sky that never cared less. Ready for a change, the elbows waited, the hands gripped hard on the desert. It's a poem by William E. Stafford, and though the title is At the Bomb Testing Site, it seems to describe our particular setting. Despite the oceans separating the listeners to this event, we are all, I suspect, dancing a tango forward and back and forward again through what Arundhati Roy called a portal. The terrain in which we sway back and advance is interesting. We are surrounded by ruins, surrounded by our conceits, quote, at the flute end of consequences, unquote, but, quote, under a sky that never cared less, unquote. Many of us in this event are fortunate, in a sense, because we have access to literature that helps us move through the long, squalid night. Some serve as torches, others as maps, and others as fireflies that constantly remind us of the acts of grace we have managed to bring with us in this, our anxious journey, and to help us make sense of the rubble we are leaving behind. Facing multiple crises, we feel lost in the turbulence of voices demanding fealty to this or that tribe. Yet in our searching, we are also found. In her poem, Last Known Residence, published in 1997 in the book Blood Sacrifice, Luisa y Gloria tells us to, quote, linger a while in this imagined country of your heart, where sometimes you must admit that what you know of me now is more than a cup could forget about fullness, unquote. We are reminded why the poet was recently chosen Poet Laureate of Virginia. For in the same poem, Gloria asks us to pause in the face of a raging pandemic, unquote, unquote. This is a lesson in distance, writes Gloria. This is a lesson in distance. Everything else is mere autobiography, waiting to be rewritten. A string leading back to a place that asks what it has become, because it could not possibly be the same, unquote. Certainly, we are in a different place today. And the book to be released to the public by Aileen Tabios gives us a glimpse of not only of where we came up short, but also why today too many lessons are learned the hard way. In one of Pagpag's pieces, Aileen Tabios points in the story A Ghost Haunting to one of several reasons why many are wrestling with a deep sense of unarticulated enemy. Quote, the optimism in my memory is a taste of rust, jarring against what I observed the country had become. The optimism is an ache that will not go away. It is a ghost haunting, unquote. The author is describing the Philippines, but it can just as well be the United States, or Brazil, or India. Think of the fireflies reminding us of the rubble of institutions crumbling from the combined force of neglect and official venality. Pagpag has plenty more insights to the dissonance we are confronting today. In the story, In the White Man in a Suit, Tabios speaks, quote, of Rome burning and how she would marvel at how the same sun rose and set on all the places where humanity marked their presence in such a variety of ways. And I would consider once more whether man's history blinded the sun, or whether God had known to create it blind at the beginning of time, unquote. In protracted acts of violence, pain is punished with forgetting. A sky painted with the palette of a bruise will remind us of trauma, but sometimes deprive us of the redeeming balm of understanding. The temptation to move on and to hit the reboot button is so great, we seem eager to discard any anchoring notion of origin, which diminishes only our sense of agency. Tabios keeps to her roots in conversations held throughout Pagpag, cleaving to, quote, a nation with a history of dying for ideals, for respect, for honor, the country of my birth, unquote. And yet, throughout the book is the sigh that acts like the silent G in lasagna. And yet, I quote again, the difference between pity and regret is simple, Tabios tells us. Pity is pity, as untranslatable as poetry. It can also rise inexplicably to be birthed by the most random of circumstances, as diverse as pitying someone for being an accountant, to pitying a species facing extinction, to pitying a shoreline disappearing under the inexorable approach of a sea. Regret, however, is a proactive reaction, a response caused first by an act made or undone by the person feeling the emotion, unquote. And what binds both feelings, to me, is the inability of these feelings to reproduce hope, since the emotions conjured often fall short of empathy. We speak of martial law and the tyrannical rule of Marcos as if these were bygone eras. I see instead Oregon and Caloocan, Los Angeles and Manila. The depth of pain and the legacy of depravity has caused and will cost many to continue to flail in desperate attempts to parry unrelenting blows. But without an abiding sense of the past, connections are lost, and even those considered today as woke may, without memory, fall asleep again. As we mourn the passing of an era that has given so little to the many who toil away unrecognized, and as we mourn the passing of ordinary humans who rose above in answer to their people's calling, we must take time as well to celebrate lives that produced second, third, fourth, fifth ranks of courage. Because the future is rarely how we imagine it, and uncertainty is something we must learn to embrace, because it means the bad guys have not won yet. We certainly won't be the last to hold the line, and neither will the kids of today be the final front. Tabios describes the feeling that many might harbor sporadically as we confront the monsters that have been let loose in our variegated lands. Quote, armchair participant, Monday morning quarterback, that's me. I once read somewhere that only in our childhood do we create gods, our gods, by simply dozing on the sidelines, failing to file a single protest against Ferdinand Marcos as his regime decimated the landscape of my birthland. I failed to protect my childhood gods, unquote. To me, this is a welcome appraisal. Yet, the injury to our sense of community, our sense of nationhood, and a future driven by working class agency and autonomy rather than spectatorship should not be confined alone to recent dark chapters. This is actually where a large part of the roots of forgetting reside. It is no longer commentary merely on Pagpag, but on forces that should act as purveyors of memory, but which are regrettably afflicted with the same reliance on rote learning and unexamined doctrines that pass on what Harry Cleaver called, quote, exercises in necromancy, in which one or another long-dead spirit is summoned from the grave to direct the battles of the present, unquote. To be blamed as well is rigidity in the left, which has studied the lives and triumphs of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, Ho Chi Minh and Bong Yen Giap, Castro and Che. But the birthdays and dates of the deaths, much less the incredible revolutionary lives of our own heroes, passed by without celebration. Apollonia Catra, the only named woman officer in President Macario Sakay's command, Teresa Magbanwa, Julian Montalan, Remedios Gomez Paraiso, also known as Commander Liwayway, Pedro Abad Santos, Jose Abad Santos, Claro Mayo Recto. No gathering by the left is organized to commemorate the birth or death of Oriang de Jesus. And we wonder why too few remember Leon Alejandro, who fought to bring down the tyranny of Ferdinand Marcos, but who was murdered a year after the fall of the dictatorship he fought, supposedly under the sway of the restored democratic order. We do not remember even the life, therefore, of people like Gloria Capitan, who fought to bring down the reign of fossil fuels as her contribution to the fight against dangerous climate change, and who was assassinated in 2016, the first recorded extrajudicial killing under the Duterte government. We are dealing with the debris of forgetting today, which continues to create the unbearable weight of loneliness, increasingly divorced as we are from the torments of our nation because we are unable to deal with the anguish and hopes of our past. It's high time we build societies where kindness and joy are the ultimate metrics of success, and where life, as Barbara Kingsolver once described it, stands on the fact that children are no longer destroyers nor the destroyed. It might have been Chaplin's M. Verdu who said, quote, when it comes to calibrating liability for murder, it is all ultimately a matter of scale, unquote. We need to develop a counterproposal where we define the past and present not only through trauma, but by the measure of grace, tolerance, and accountability society can enjoy. Three elements we will need desperately to see us through rougher, far more difficult days ahead, as the climate crisis brings about even worse impacts in the most vile behavior among would-be leaders. To survive and thrive in the near future, we will need everyone. We will need to revisit the past constantly, for sure, not as a bludgeon to smash our enemies, but as a constant companion in our effort to distill meaning in our fleeting lives. Because everything will count, and because the written word will always, always be our strongest and most reliable ally. Thank you.
Thank you, Red. Our final presenter before we head into the conversation and Q&A is S. Lily Mendoza. She's a professor of culture and communication at Oakland University, Rochester, Michigan, and the director of the Center for Babaylan Studies. Her research focuses on questions of identity and subjectivity, cultural politics in national, post, and transnational contexts, discourses of indigenization, race and ethnicity, and more recently, civilization and climate change. She is the author of Between the Homeland and the Diaspora, The Politics of Theorizing Filipino and Filipino-American Identities, and Back from the Crocodile's Belly, Philippine Babaylan Studies, and the Struggle of Indigenous Memory. Welcome, Lily.
Salamat, Michelle. Greetings from Wawi-Yatano, where the river bends, otherwise known as Detroit, home of the Anishinaabe people and of the Iroquois, Fox, Miami, Wyandot, and Saw. I call it provocative, Eileen's titling of her book, Pagpag. Pagpag is such a fascinating phenomenon, both horrific and quintessentially creative, Pinoy style, the making of life out of discarded scraps of food. In a lot of ways, scandalous, making those of us not living in precarity to recoil and squirm in horror, imagining the hundreds or thousands of germs and bacteria lurking that no amount of pagpapagpag or attempt to slough off can effectively get rid of. Eileen's condemnation of pagpag is spot on when she says, pagpag is never okay, especially in a land where others spend 15 million pesos on a handbag, quoting Ninoch Carrasca. Indeed, there's much to be said for condemning the conditions that would compel any segment of a population to have to resort to such desperate measures in order to simply survive in what is, or at least used to be, a land of abundance. Yet in the same way that this beautiful book before us has been forged out of the author's burning outrage at the Marcos dictatorship that forcibly drove her and her family in exile away from the homeland, I see as well the first grace, creativity, and capacity for beauty making, what native writers on Turtle Island refer to as survivance, manifest here in what we might call the culinary genius of pagpag making. As Nanay Jean says when interviewed by a reporter, there are days when all I can put my trust into is my faith. There are days when there is absolutely nothing to eat, but there are good days when I'm grateful that people toss out a lot of their food scraps for me to earn money from. For them, it may not mean much, but to me, it means everything. I am brought to tears reflecting on the spirit of so simple and matter-of-fact of a report. No recrimination, no shaking of the fist against the gods or gnashing of the teeth in despair, just gratitude. But no hand-wringing or resignation either. Left with nothing but the detritus of long-running injustice, a state and societal system that from its inception has never been about taking care of the poor or ensuring equality. For example, post-Marxist philosophers Hart and Negri called the US Republic, and for that matter, I would say all nation states, as republic of property, existing mainly not to enforce justice, democracy, or equality, but to protect property, i.e. the moneyed class. Left with such, isn't it all the more remarkable that Nanay Jin and the likes of her still find the courage and creativity to make a way out of no way? I have, not too long ago, written an essay titled Composting Civilization's Grief, Life, Love, and Learning in a Time of Eco-Apocalypse, also appearing in a volume edited by Eileen. For compounding the immediate threats in the homeland of extrajudicial killings and the slow creep of authoritarianism and suppression of press freedom, and here in the US of the resurgence of white nationalism, racial violence, and the ubiquitous recourse to state terrorism to quell dissent and social unrest are the bigger existential challenges confronting us all today. Scientists say that the sixth great mass extinction is now underway, with catastrophic climate change and COVID-19 delivering a full halt megaphone communication to our species. In the face of such, who or where might we turn to for wisdom on how to live what remains of our days? In the few decades that I've been tracking in my studies, the different cultural logics constituting our modern industrial culture and that of our hunting and gathering ancestors that set our DNA and who lived mostly by the generosity of what the earth provided, some of whom are still around, like the Aita peoples in my native home province of Pampanga. I'm only now slowly beginning to understand why everything in the latter culture has to be done with ritual care, beauty, and elegance, and always with the courtesy of asking for permission, versus the prioritizing of utilitarian efficiency and human entitlement in the former culture. It is because for the latter, there is sacrality in relating to wild earth as mother and to the beings that feed them as relatives, whether plants that were gathered or animals that were hunted. And that the point of life is to live worthy of the magnificence and generosity of that arrangement and to reflect that magnificence in their way of being. So when the time comes for them to take their turn at becoming food for others, they make sure they become a delicious meal. In the same spirit, indigenous healers would not only go and take from the healing plants what they need, but would court the mother plant with plaintive song, so she may generously give up her medicine in response. Our native teacher, Martin Prechtel, that my husband Jim and I study with, reminds us that the purpose of life is not to get what we want, unless what we want is to make beauty that can cause everything to jump up and live again. It is time, he says, to stop asking for what humans want. That project has long gone bankrupt, but to ask instead, what does the ground want? What do the trees, mountains, soils, rocks, animals, waters, birds, fishes, plants, thunder beings, minerals, etc. want? British mythologist Martin Shaw says, and I quote, "We're living in a time when we're heavily defended against experiences of our own beauty. It's not a question of victory, but the capacity to make homemaking skills again in ourselves for something that is bigger than us, that we learn to bend our head again, that we learn some humility." And I like how he puts it when he says, "We were caught in a love affair with the tumbling earth. And if our time is drawing to a close, should we not make beauty with it? Should we not? What possible fucking message should we be giving our kids, other than that. Pagpag making, in this sense, for all its contradictory significations, like Eileen's skillful reworking of painful and grievous memories of the Marcos regime into stories of alternative meaning, delight, and pleasure, may be seen as gesturing toward just that kind of capacity for beauty and life-making in the direst of circumstances. I would say perhaps a skill those of us still ensconced in the comfort of our privilege could well learn from. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. And now as we get to the Q&A, I'm going to unmute Eileen and all the panelists.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Shall I moderate? Okay. So as we move to our discussion of the book, just to briefly go back. So thank you, Paring Bert, for
Thank you, Joy.
really talking about all the possibilities, lahat pwede of the title. Thank you, Nerissa, for talking about how humor was effectively used as a weapon by Eileen in her short stories. Thank you, Red, for talking about the importance of memory. Thank you, Lily, for your talk about creativity and connecting indigenous knowledge to the present. So perhaps just to start the ball rolling, we can talk maybe about how the book also resonates with us in our respective fields, or if there is maybe perhaps a particular line or a particular story or a particular character in the book that you might want to talk about or suggest to possible readers of the book. Anything?
Well, I'll start, but I don't know. I have really bad Wi-Fi. I live in the suburbs, so you know, my voice might drop. But what I wanted to start with was just the title. Although Paring Bert's discussion is so brilliant in how he was able to unpack the different meanings of Pagpag. I wanted to share another meaning, which is the cultural critic Walter Benjamin says that storytellers are also rag pickers. You know, you look through garbage and you try to make something out of it. And when I found out that you know, the rag picker was an image for storytelling, at least for this critic, for Benjamin, I was like, oh, I have to tell this to Eileen. So I wanted to share this. So, you know, apart from the discussion of Paring Bert, I wanted to mention that this is an aesthetic of, I mean, this is what storytellers do. We pick things, and we, you know, sometimes they are things that have been thrown, they're refused, they're things that are no longer important, you know, or considered, they're considered garbage, right? But I think that what is brilliant about the short stories of Eileen is that she picks things and she tries to show another, as Joy said, that there is a truth that is underlined. I'm fascinated. I told this to Eileen because I was fascinated with, and I'm so happy you read from Ghost Hunting, because I love Ghost Hunting, and with the protagonist, you know, who was this sort of snooty, you know, banker, and then she sees her racial doppelganger Marites, and you know they're actually and the protagonist knows that white people, when there's that lovely paragraph that Eileen read, that, you know, in a white supremacist culture, brown women are just the same. They don't care. Even if you have a fancy degree, you're still either the waitress in the village, or you know, or someone else they met, someone else they fucked, you know, maybe decades back, you know. So it's the idea of picking things from memory, picking things that have been discarded, and making a story. And so I found it really very meaningful that the title of the short stories, the short story collection is Pagpag. So again, this is just to say brava to the author. Maraming salamat.
Anyone else talking about the stories or the titles of the stories, or what Eileen read or Lisa talked about?
You know, to say, when I was, you got and straight out of at school, so I was a young analyst and therefore a young woman. When I was put in various situations within the banking world, I did not have either the maturity, strength, or wisdom to respond back way through this. And on one level, just one level, I think that's the involving that bank opportunist was a way to say things that I didn't have the or strength to say back then when I was a younger woman, a younger banker. So, you know, just, and in that sense, you know, that's a great writing, right? You can write your revenge in the world. What happened? Yeah.
Lily?
Yeah. You know, I had to ask Eileen after reading her book whether it's autobiographical, right? And the reason for that is because I remember you were, when did you give? I think you also gave a response to a book during one of our Center for Babaylan Studies conferences, and you ended up with, you turned around and made a farting gesture. I don't know if you remember. And I just said, she has the body of a Pinoy in its exuberance and freedom. And you know, my husband tells me that when he first saw me speaking to my sisters in Kapampangan, she said, you literally become a very different body. And I saw that in your stories, in your way of telling them. And in many places I would laugh, and and especially when you were writing about, you know, very local practices, and you even had this, and I forget the title, where you had the pig. Is it Carmela? You know, your husband is supposed to be in love with, or having an affair with this young woman, or I followed that, and then all of a sudden seeing getting horrified at the sight of this lechon with the apple in the mouth, right? This dear darling, is it Carmela? I forget.
Yes, I have a perverse sense of humor.
Yeah, so I love that, Eileen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That does reflect a lot of affection I have for my home village back in San Masa, Mocosur. I loved the villagers there, and so I wrote a lot of those stories just for affection for them, and missing them so much, and the loss of not having shared the bulk of my life in their company. Yeah, it's trying to redeem loss. Yes. But I was very grateful to Father Burke for your discussion of the title, and I should say that actually, and I'm not fluent in Tagalog either, I didn't know all those meanings of Pagpag, even including the original one, which is until people reminded me, Pagpag kayo, yeah. I didn't know all that. I literally came onto the term when I saw the YouTube videos from the BBC or whatever about the people eating through the dumps. And what that moment was, it was sort of a straw on the camel's back for me, because I had been, I guess, had this simmering anger many years, which actually for me boiled over in the effect of the U.S. president on culture. A lot about this, about how one of the things that's so offensive to me under the current administration can be manifested by, I don't know if you know this, about how this young schoolboy, American schoolboy, U.S. American, in third grade, fourth grade, something like that, was talking back, and aggressively so, at his teacher. And that to me was an example of how culture has shifted, because there are certain things that we used to take for granted, like respect your elders, don't talk about certain cultural traits, like used to lie, lying is bad. The basic kind of things have just been, pushed about, I guess, with the effect of social media. And so we can see that the whole notion of Pagpag taken by the Marcos family to rehabilitate their reputations, which they have succeeded so. And, there's a reason why Marcos is still not frozen in the Ilocos, but is now in this so-called cemetery, hero cemetery. I mean, all of that was offensive to me. And then I got to the BBC documentary where I'm seeing the people eat these sources of hepatitis and all other diseases, while on the other spectrum, the Filipinos, spending so much on a mere handbag or a pair of shoes. And so there's something that happened in culture, the U.S., the Philippines, and I'm sure, as Red says, around, something happened where things, positive attributes that we used to take for granted no longer exist. And that is reflected too in who comes to be political leaders. And so all that was, captured for me in that moment when I'm watching. If you picture me watching this documentary on the poor Filipinos eating through the slums, and then I said, okay, I'm a writer, so I write, so let's create a book about it,
So it's a rare occasion like this when we have the author, and we can ask questions about, can ask the author questions about possible sources and influences or other insights. So if there's anyone here in this Zoom space who has questions, I think maybe we can open it up. Melinda, yes, go for it.
Thank you so much for these. This is just, my mind is blowing. And I'm really hoping that, because I'm a real visual learner, that if you guys would like to share parts of these papers, I would love just to read it over to make sure. I'm trying to take notes, but not getting it all. Eileen, I have a direct question for you. I am in the middle, it's taken me like 9 months to write an article about Filipinas, Pinays and comics right now, Trinidad Escobar and Malacca Garib. When I was interviewing Trinidad, she talked to me about the fact that she doesn't believe that there is a Pinay comics aesthetic, and I thought that was a very interesting idea because other cartoonists say that there is. But the point that Trinidad brought up to me was that she felt that as opposed to a comics aesthetic, that there is a Pinay Gothic that runs through all of the works by Filipinas that we have. And it really gave me pause to think about what that Gothic, what the Pinay Gothic specifically looks like. And just hearing you read and hearing all the papers today, I can really see how this is a huge aesthetic that I really need to be considering further in the work that I'm doing, just in terms of how it relates to haunting, the supernatural, and this kind of circular, the circuity, or this circularness, for lack of a better word, because I can't really, I'm trying to talk too fast here. In terms of the confrontations, the constant confrontations with trauma, imperialism, and history, you know, how this past becomes our constant present as Pinays. And I was just wondering if this idea of the Pinay Gothic is something that you might see in your work, or that you think goes through Filipina writing. Thanks.
Well, you know, it's not something that I articulate to call it a Pinay Gothic, but I can see why that would be mentioned by Trinidad and mentioned by others. The very first story in the book starts out with, you know, the protagonist is a young boy, and they are visited by a ghost. But that actually, I swear to God, that is based on a real life incident. When I was a young child in Baguio, we were visited by a ghost. And some of the elements of that story, you know, the fact that apparently when a body is taken over by a ghost, you cover her with black, you know, that's all true from my, you know, one could say I don't get it correctly, but in my memory, those incidents occurred. And there are, you know, elements of just Filipino lives and lifestyles where we are dealing with ghosts, but we don't consider them ghosts from the Western perspective. They're just part of, you know, what's, you know, the lifestyle around us. So I guess when you translate that, all of that into, when you combine that inescapable history that we have, which is just replete with trauma from a variety of sources, then it would be logical that you could come up with some Pinay Gothic. As I said, I never called it that in my mind, but as soon as she said that, a light bulb kind of like went off over my head. And I see the logic of that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Other questions for Eileen? We're supposed to end actually at 9:30, but I think we have 10 more minutes extension for more questions for Eileen. This is our chance.
I think we have a question in the chat from Lenny. She says, you wrote these stories in the 90s. If you are writing short stories about these times, I wonder what themes you will be playing with.
You mean playing with, you're writing stories about today. If you're writing stories about today, I wonder what things you'll be. Well, I will be, of course, I just finished my first novel. And the theme there is something that I learned through my exposure to the decolonization and indigenous taught to me by Lenny and Lily through the Center for Babaylan Studies. And so I just wrote a novel where the protagonist is theoretically a modern day version of a Babaylan. What would a Babaylan look like in the 21st century, you know, created from scratch? Now, in my novel's case, because I was concerned about appropriation, etc., the country is called Pacifica, not Philippines, but it is described in the novel as once upon a time, Pacifica and the Philippines was one, not an archipelago, one same island, and over time the two split into two modern day countries. And I'm in versus the Philippines. But the Babaylan in my story, I don't call Babaylan, I call Bye-Bye. You know, you can see the references, right? But all of the stuff that I developed through there are stuff that I learned about through my exposure to the Center for Babaylan Studies. So Salamat Lenny, Salamat Lily as well. But yeah, so that's what I'm tinkering with. My own take on the Filipino, or trying to cheat of authenticity.
Salamat, Eileen, for being the most productive.
Creative. I'm just trying to be creative, not cheat.
When is
The,
it coming out?
the most productive writer ever. You're so productive. We almost hate you. Nasa inggit.
Yes.
Well, inggitera lang.
There's only one. It only needs to have a life. Really, that's all. It really does,
Mga inggitera pala lahat ng guests.
Tama na ako doon.
Because so
What I'm grateful to all the guests is that they you all, especially Red and everybody who spoke, sound way more intelligent than I actually am. Just FYI. And I don't believe my own PR. You know, I mean, oh sure, that's great, but I.
Okay. Other questions? Else?
When is the novel coming out, Eileen?
Out?
Oh, it's being considered by a publisher as we speak. And let me tell you something. I've gone through. It's a so-called literary fiction, so it's not categorized as commercial by the publishers. But one publisher who's looking at it as we speak, and maybe I'll have some good news, or maybe, and if it's a no, then I might sit on it for a while, actually. But there is a possibility. We'll see. I mean, it even won an earlier version of the manuscript, was actually a finalist in this global competition for first-time novels. Sponsored by some group based in Greece. I can't really enter competitions. I only entered this one because the prize was, trip to Greece before the pandemic. But so there's something in that novel, and I have faith in that novel. It's just a question of, the more. What would be great if that novel got published is just because nobody has looked at a babaylan from that standpoint. That would be so, to me, not just as a writer, but as a reader, it'd be intriguing. What would be a 21st century scratch to, and by the way, that goes into issues of, so you create this indigenous tribe. What we find in that tribe? In my novel, a critical component is that to be considered a member of the tribe, have a poet. They have to, but a particular type of poet, they write witness poems. In other words, in order to write a poem, they have to be kind of like activists for the environment, for nature, etc. And they have to be active. They can't just write a fictional poem. They have to do something good before they can write a poem. So that's like, I had to do citizenship threshold for a tribe based on this. I mean, it would be interesting if it came out.
In fact, that's what we're learning, that indigenous cultures are big on eloquence.
Yes.
Because you need to be eloquent in courting in speaking.
Eloquence is a interesting perspective because in order to best articulate something, presumably you'd have to be, quote, have some expertise in it. And the way to be an expert in something is to be proactively involved in that, whatever that matter is, not just, like imagining things and coming up with something. So yeah, I get that eloquence would be critical.
So when they do their sun salutation in the morning and greet grandfather's son, coming out of the egg of night, or it is just so amazing. And you have to almost know all the detailed characteristics of the beings that you are courting, right? Otherwise, you won't know how to address them, and
it'll show,
yeah. And so even their youth, once they see the stars, when the first moment when they fall in love, that becomes a sign that they need to go through initiation, and part of the initiation is learning eloquence, eloquent speaking, eloquent language. It's courtship language, and I remember, I was a comparative literature major in college, and And I was told that I write too flowery. You know, my writing is and I had to be trained in extra story writing, and now I'm having to reclaim that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now, pwede na other questions, even about the future, about the novel soon to be published. Not just about Pagpag. Move on na tayo. Next project.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions? I'd just like to ask Eileen how the process is different. Because you jump from poetry to fiction very seamlessly. So it's as if like you're thinking as a fictionist 1 minute, and then quickly you go back to poetry and move back again. So.
Well, it's actually very simple for me. Everything I do is from the position of being a poet. But I'm one of those poets that believe that all genres are part of poetry. Everything is part of poetry. Poetry is everything. So I don't necessarily see the genre differentiations, although it's purely convenient to have them. To me, the Pagpag is also a form of poetry. But if you were to, if I believe in the differentiation between poems and prose, I would say this. The reason why Pagpag seemingly is a collection of short stories is that poetry failed me. I needed to be, I believe, didactic to do the kind of stories that in Pagpag. None of this, abstruse, referential, abstracted, whatever. No, you actually be very, very didactic. And in what is known as poetry, didacticism is not necessarily a good thing. So, I actually had to, when you want to call someone well, no, I won't say that word. You have to sometimes. You can't around it, Yeah.
Okay. Kasi nga, this is not just a forum. This is also some kind of reading. There's a special request for Paring Bert naman daw to recite a poem. There's a I'm so sorry, wala na po akong magagawa. May special request. Please accommodate us now. Because I think you have the book with you naman. If you can perhaps share lang a poem from your book. Please lang daw po. If possible. If you can share a poem from your book since you have it.
Okay. My first book of poems, I have 3 books of poems na ngayon. It's called Sanayan Lang Pagpatay. Maraming tula dito galing sa karanasan ko sa Davao. Maraming mga pinapatay na talaga doon noon pa. At nagpapasalamat din ako sa pag-alala nila Red, yung ibang mga pinatay dyan. Tinanong ko kay Red yung anong title nung poem. Kasi I heard lizard. And yung lead poem dito, yung Sanayan Lang Pagpatay, ay tungkol sa iba't ibang paraan ng pagpatay ng butiki. Different ways of killing lizards. So siguro, I'll recite it. And it's about killing lizards, which is a good training for killing people. Pagpatay ng tao. Sanayan lang yan, pare. Parang sa butiki. Sa una, siyempre, ikay nangingimik. Hindi mo masikmurang tiradurin o hampasing tulad ng ipis at lamok. Pagkat para bang lagi iyang nakadapo sa noo ng santo sa altar. At tila may tinig na nagsasabing, shh, bawal, bawal, bawal yang pumatay. Subalit, ang pagpatay tulad ng maraming bagay ay natututunan din kung magtiyaga kang makinig sa mahigit na karanasan. Ako po, nakuha ko sa chewing ko kung paanong pilantikin ng lampin ang nakatitig na butiki sa aming kisame. At kapag nalaglag na sa sahig ay agad ipitin na hindi makapuslit habang dahan-dahang tipon ang buong bigat sa isang paang nakatingkayad sabay bagsak. Magandang pagsasanay ito sapagkat hindi mo nakikita. Naririnig lamang na lumalangot-ngot ang butot bungo ng lintik na butiking hindi na makahalutiktik. Kung sa bagay, kilabutin yan sa mga gamo-gamo. Nang magtagal-tagal ay naging malikhay na rin ang aking mga kamay sa pagdukit ng mata, pagblade ng paa, pagpisa ng itlog sa loob ng tiyan hanggang mamilipit siyang parang nasa ibabaw ng baga. At kung panahon ng Pasko't maraming paputok, maingat kong sinusubuan niya ng rabintador upang sa pagsabog ay magpaalaman ang nguso at buntot. Kung sa kaya't ang pagpatay ay nakasasawa rin kung minsan. Mabuti na lamang at may pinto at bintana na kahit hindi mo sinasadya ay may sariling paraan ng pagpuksa ng buhay. Ganyan lang talaga ang pagpatay. Kung hindi ako, ay iba naman ang babanat. Kung hindi ngayon, ay sa iba namang oras. Subalit ang higit na nagbibigay sa akin ng lakas ng loob ay ang malalim nating pagsasamahan. Habang ako'y pumapatay, kayo nama'y nanonood. Nanonood lang kayo.
Bravo! Bravo!
That is so powerful, especially
Bravo.
the ending.
I know.
Nanonood. So,
Yeah, so siguro may kasamang guilt, but every time nagkaroon ng mamasapan ho, ang patuan, paring Bert, na sana yung yung libro mo. Please recite it. I've recited it several times and I've memorized it and I perform it. And it still pains me. What pains me is the numbness. Kaya kailangan pagpag yung yuyug-yugin. Kasi parang nasanay na tayo. It's ordinary. We don't count. We stop counting. At nalulungkot ako. May iba pa nga dito eh. Well, buti nga sa kanila. Buti nga sa kanila. Mga ganyan. So, maganda yung sinasabi nga ni Red na let's continue remembering and with names and with faces. And let's ritualize it and literalize it and recite it. Let's not forget. Siguro ako, let me synthesize this for myself. We mentioned Baguio, the US, indigenous peoples, dictatorship, and violence, papailan. Right now, I'm doing a research on Bishop Claver. He built stone path here. Bishop Claver is the first Igorot bishop. Eh dito sa mini forest, natabunan na ng mga dahon, na-discover ko meron pala siyang ginawang mga terraces and even rock formation na hindi na pinapansin. Now I'm doing a study, putting it back in the horizon of Igorot culture. And you know, when he was studying in Woodstock in US, he also built those stone construction. And he fought martial law, he fought the dictatorship. Kaya nagkakadugtong-dugtong yung indigenous people's cultural grounding. And he wrote very good English, in very good English. Kaya lang yun nga, parang natatabunan na siya. Gusto ko lang ibalik. Salamat Red, salamat sa indigenous people. Salamat Eileen for connecting me to the US. Sometimes we're so focused on what's happening here. And I thank you for being far and yet very, very intimately close. Yung magkakadugtong ng ating mga bituka. Magkakadugtong. So thank you very much for that. I'm really touched by your concerns.
So thank you very much, Paring Bert. So I was just looking at the website the Facebook site of SACA, Kilusang Magbubukid ng mga Pilipinas, and more than 262 farmers have been killed during the Duterte regime, not to mention the bombings and the threats to the Lumad schools in Mindanao. So I would also, in behalf of the artist activists of SACA, I'd also like to extend their thanks to you, Eileen, for your support to them. So, any final thoughts? Dahil 6:45 na. So, I think if anyone in this Zoom meeting or any one of the panelists would like to give any final words, if not, we have to give it back to Eileen for any final words.
Well,
before we officially close.
Oh, okay. Well, I just want to say thank you, Agyamanak, maraming salamat to all of you for taking the time and to pay attention to this book. It's clearly not about something going on here. It's clearly not about me or what I've written. I think it has to do with just, this book is just an excuse, yet an excuse for a pause to look back, just a pause so that maybe, so that we just don't keep going on and on and on. I mean, I am, I get very depressed when I see the media coverage of what's going on in both US and the Philippines. And sometimes there's no pause for reflection, and from reflection, something more meaningful to come out of that. That's all I really wanted to do with this book. And thank you all for supporting it. And thank you, Paloma Press.
Yay. So before I give it back to Eileen with an A, let's toast to Eileen! Tabios!
Wow, we have two Eileens.
Wow. Thank you and
Thank you.
congratulations.
And I'm really also moved that the Philippines is involved in this event. It is just, you can't tell me. Thank you.
Eileen.
Thank you, everyone. This has been a brutal year, which makes this presentation, this gathering, all the more necessary and invaluable and historic. I wanted to thank all our participants, Joy Barrios, Albert Alejo, Nerissa Balfe, Michelle Bautista, Red Constantino, Herna Cruz-Louie, Melinda Luis de Jesus, S. Lily Mendoza, and Aileen Tabios, and those who joined us via Zoom and Facebook Live. Hanggang sa muling pagkikita, maraming salamat sa inyong lahat. Padayon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you sa inyo lahat.